The mile. We've all done at least one of these in our lives, whether it's a walk at the park, your hometown, or that one gym class you tried to avoid but couldn't because it was a part of your grade. The distance has become the building blocks for how most people understand the sport of running. The event has somewhat faded into obscurity ever since the metric mile or 1500-meter run became the primary staple, as given every other event follows the metric system. It only seemed logical for championships like the Olympics and other prestigious events to incorporate this race permanently. Despite this fact, the mile has a more than rich enough history that dates back much longer than you may think, and its progression, rivalries, and barriers are some of the most astonishing feats to grace the athletics era today. Let's go back a few centuries to where it all started and get into the world record progression of the mile. The origins of the mile race date back a few hundred years ago, but the documentation or validity of them is obscenely scarce. The term racing wasn't used back then as much, as it was more so referred to the act of pedestrianism, where more often than not, people would partake in races, primarily long-distance walking, where they would try to win themselves or other people money depending on who partook in the gambling. Our first athlete goes by the name of James Parrott, a costermonger that sold fruits and vegetables in central London. He wagered a bet of a few guineas that he could run a 4-minute mile through the streets of London, with a very specific route in mind. Parrott had allegedly successfully ran this 4-minute mile and had received his guineas. Skeptics understandably remained as such since this claim lacks plenty of nuance regarding how this record was actually timed or measured, and especially how vague 4 minutes as a final time is. This wasn't the only instance of an 18th century man betting on his talent to break the 4-minute barrier, as a man simply denoted as Powell had wagered a 1,000 guinea bet to do the same thing, but came in finishing at 4 minutes and 3 seconds. A decade later, another man under one name, Weller, had become the one to fulfill the goal, winning 3 guineas. The same suspicions remain, but it's certainly an interesting thought to entertain that your average working man in the 1700s could have been running 4-minute miles to make some extra money. To kick off the 19th century, a man by the name of Captain Barclay was known for his phenomenal feats of pedestrianism, walking over 100 miles in a single day. One source, however, refers to a much faster endeavor where he faced off against a man named John Ireland. With 500 guineas on the line, Barclay supposedly tired out Ireland by 3/4 in and finished the mile in a time of 4 minutes 50 seconds. A much more believable time for the era. In terms of more well-documented times, at least according to the popular English newspaper Bell's Life, an article reports a time 20 seconds faster than Barclay's, as a race between two men eventually resulted in one by the name of James Metcalfe as the winner, running 4 minutes 30 seconds. William Matthews was credited with a time of 4 minutes 38 seconds on July 2nd, 1849, but the article goes on to say that it could have been run in well under 4.5. Similar circumstances could be said about the man he raced against, Charles Westall, as on July 26, 1852, he was allotted a time of 4 minutes 30 seconds and something under, which again makes it rather difficult to deduce what times he was reported to have run. On July 12, 1858, Thomas Hospel would appear in the British scene as the first man to run a properly timed mile. As in a race against Job Smith, he finished to a roaring crowd and a new record of 4 minutes 23 seconds. The record would stop falling drastically after this, but plenty of new names in the upcoming years would surface very quickly, and pedestrianism would begin to see a massive climb in popularity from a participant and spectator point of view. On October 27, 1860, Sia Albison went up against William Lang in a nail-biter race where Albison clutched it out not only for the win, but beat the mile record by 3/4 of a second as well. Lang would eventually redeem himself a few years later, taking the mile record down a second on July 11, 1863, and then Edward Mills securing a record of his own on April 23, 1864. One of the larger drops in the record, however, would be shared between pedestrian William Richards and William Lang again, with a time of 4:17.25 on August 19, 1865. The reason why they shared the record was because the two men finished so close to each other that the judge ruled it as a dead heat or a tie, crediting both men with the record. With the 4:20 barrier broken, the record had gone uncontested for over a decade, but another William would be on the come-up, William Cummings, securing a 4:18.5 mile time. Then on May 14, 1881, the 16-year-old record would be broken by Cummings, running 4:16.2. Our last record within the heart of England would be finished off by legendary English runner Walter George, running 4:12.75, a near 4-second drop in the record. He had actually called his shot years ago, telling his friends that he would run a 4:12 mile and would fulfill this prophecy perfectly to cement himself as the best 19th century English runner ever. With 4:12 as the current world standard and the sport of running slowly becoming an international phenomenon, there was one and only one wall to break that everyone wanted to grab at, and that was the elusive and quite possibly obtainable sub 4-minute mile. The concept of a sub 4-minute mile had been teased before, but with the record halted at 4:12 for well over a decade, believers of the legendary barrier had seen more promising days, and it was looking questionable whether or not we would see a sub 4:10 mile anytime soon. One key event would happen that would completely revamp the way track and field operated, and not only would the sport begin to explode in popularity, but this would also mean other countries would get involved, and they wanted a shot at making history themselves. The International Amateur Athletics Federation, aka the IAAF, or now referred to as World Athletics, was created in the summer of 1912 following the Olympics of that year. Up until this point, athletics never had a governing body to regulate the rules, facilities, but most importantly, the actual times themselves. The current world record, like we mentioned before, was 4:12.75 by Walter George, but the first ratified record by the IAAF would be set by John Paul Jones on May 31st, 1913. Following right up would be the first world record that was also an IAAF record, as Norman Tabor had beaten Walter George's time for the first time in 29 years, running 4:12.6 on July 6th, 1915. With the federation to take care of track and field by providing more structure to the sport as a whole, this allowed milers from all around the world to get their name out there, and the British were now going to have their work cut out for them, but so were the Americans as well. In 1920, Paavo Nurmi from Finland, deemed the Flying Finn, won 4 medals at the Olympic Games in Antwerp, securing 3 gold medals in the 10,000 meters, cross-country race, and the team cross-country race. Nurmi was not a miler at all. In fact, he claimed to have never even trained for the mile, but still managed to run a 4:13.9 in Stockholm in 1921 and would swing at the record once again a year later. In a time trial organized in Stockholm, sources pointed out that he wanted to run a more evenly paced race to take the record, but this plan had fallen apart within the first lap, running under a minute for the first quarter and coming through the half mile at around 2:03. After dropping his opponent, Edvin Wide, the Flying Finn stormed through the last lap to take the record by over 2 seconds, finishing in 4:10.4. Nurmi would go on to become the most decorated athlete in Swedish history. Over a decade had gone by since world records became officially tracked, and while we're seeing a bit more diversity throughout milers, the record had only fallen twice within a 10-year span, leaving the next 10-second oriented barrier out in the open. It wouldn't even be another 8 years until Frenchman Jules Ladumig broke the 4:10 barrier for the first time on October 4th, 1931, running 4:09.2. This record, thankfully, would kickstart it to fall much more often this decade, as a different country was breaking the record every couple years. Jack Lovelock was the first Kiwi from New Zealand to snag the record running 4:07.6, and Glenn Cunningham and Sidney Wooderson would lower it a tad more with 4:06.8 and 4:06.4 respectively. The 1930s was the most active decade by far, and a true shift in momentum for the record to start falling down a reasonable amount. But with the end of World War II, this would sadly put an abrupt halt or an outright dismissal of some running careers. But one country had 2 athletes that sparked an intense rivalry that no one could contest, with an even larger twist to go along with it. Let's delve into what I like to call the Swedish invasion. The Swedish had a couple athletes that had the potential to threaten the record, Edvin Wide being the earliest of the Swedes, but none had been able to fully bring the record back to their country. 2 young men that were able to train together had realized that they could push each other to not only work towards the record, but perhaps towards the forbidden sub 4-minute mile. Let's start with a man by the name of Gunder Hägg. Gunder Hägg began to show his talent for running at the age of 17 and had a fairly experimental and field-based training style, utilizing the recently devised method of fartleks. Fartleks is a training method created by bronze decathlete Gustav Omer, where he had his athletes run in variations between faster than race pace and jogging. This vague description of training is a more self-psychological method of race workouts, as it relies on the runner themselves to control their fast and slow paces without the use of any direct measurements. And back then, runners would breeze through the woods and tackle hills of all sorts to maximize running variety, and his older teammate had a somewhat similar style too. Arne Andersson saw fantastic success early in his distance running career as well, grabbing a Swedish mile title at the age of 18 and trained plenty in the forest like his friendly rival, but would eventually capitalize on the speed side of things much more when he became a teacher down the line. Running 4:08 in Stockholm in 1941, Andersson was just a couple seconds shy of the record already, but Hägg was one, or quite a few steps ahead, as he set the new world record in the 1500 just a month after Andersson's mile time, running 3:47.6, equivalent to a 4:05.8 mile. On July 1st, 1942, Hägg and Andersson would race in Göteborg, Sweden, both in top shape to run a blistering fast time. Haig would be the one to finish over Anderson with a new world record of 406.1, and Anderson finishing in just 0.3 seconds behind. Anderson would attempt to break the record again in Stockholm, but just about tied the record instead. Haig would begin to take off a couple months later to run 404.6 on September 4th, 1942, separating himself quite a bit from the rest of the pack. Haig had garnered support from the Americans and was renowned as Gunder the Wonder. They wanted to see the world's best miler in person, and Haig wanted to show the people over in America how to really run the mile. This spurred an idea for Haig to travel to the States, but it wasn't going to be smooth sailing by any means. At the time, the most efficient way for Haig to safely get to the US was to board a merchant ship called the Saturnus. It would take about a month through this method, so he was going to need to find a way to stay in shape in the meantime. The ship apparently had a roughly 70-meter passageway that was only usable during stable sea conditions. It shouldn't come as a surprise that 25 days later, Haig was in shaky aerobic condition on arrival, and his first race in the States would coincidentally be up against another elite runner who had been at sea for a while too. Winning in a subpar 5,000-meter time of 14:48, Haig needed a few weeks if he wanted to really get back to his roots and to maybe lower the mile record once more. You can imagine the stress and exhaustion Haig was under, especially since he had been told that Anderson beat his record by a second on July 1st, 1943, running 402.6, just 2.5 seconds from the 359 mile. Haig was still struggling quite a bit to get back in world record shape, as while he was still beating America's finest, the competition wasn't intense enough to get him those last few seconds despite being in relatively good racing shape again. Haig returned home by 1943 and was flown back to Sweden this time, but wouldn't begin serious training until January 1944. Just months after his return to his home country, Haig had broken the 1500-meter record running 343.0, which is equivalent to a 4.8 mile. With this type of confidence back, Haig decided to try and contest Anderson for the mile, but just fell shy, as Anderson would take the new world record of 401.6 on July 18th, 1944. He would also go on to beat Haig in almost every race they partook in for the year of 1944. There was one race that Haig would have a better chance at taking the record, but he needed another year to prepare for it, and it was going to be the closest mile race to date. The Swedish duo would race once again on July 17th, 1945 at the Malmö Mile. Haig was not only back to business, but Anderson was the one who had a title to defend rather than chase. The pace wasn't holding back in the slightest, as they took the first 440 yards out in 56.5 and 62.7 for the second lap, coming through 880 yards in 159.2. With the pacemaker gone and the Swedes left to compete, Haig had trudged on to take the lead going into the last lap as they passed the 3/4 mile mark at 3:01, meaning they needed a sub 59 second lap to break 4. Apparently, Anderson had stepped on the cartridge shell from the starting gun that was left over and struggled to stay stride for stride with Haig. And as the last 100 meters closed in, Haig was able to fend his teammate off to secure the new world record of 401.4. Haig and Anderson single-handedly brought the world record down by 5 seconds in just 3 years, and they had plenty more in the tank to keep pushing the record down. Unfortunately, the two men would see the end of their careers much faster than anyone could have thought, as the IAAF had banned them from competing any further due to violations within the federation, particularly the notion of receiving payments for their running efforts, something that goes against the very nature of an amateur status. This was a heartbreaking stop to the most exciting era in the mile that had the potential to keep going. Some men had run 404 or 403 in the following years, but the record just didn't feel even remotely threatened unless it was Haig or Anderson stepping on that line. The road to sub 4 was a reality now, but perhaps still a dream that only one man could fulfill. And that man's name may have just been Roger Bannister. Roger Bannister from Great Britain was a supreme talent in distance running as early as the age of 12, winning a junior cross-country race with very minimal training. Another example is when he attended the Oxford Freshman Mile at age 17, running a time of 4:53, and again, was only training 2 days a week, one of those days being the race itself. Committing to Oxford for medicine, Bannister would eventually find time to start running a bit more seriously in 1947, bringing his mile time down nearly 30 seconds in a single year, but couldn't find anyone to coach him, nor did he seem quite fond of international competition due to a lack of preparation. Fast forward to 1949, Bannister's mile time had fallen to 4:11. With a focus on the 800 temporarily in 1950, his mile time would halt briefly, but would begin to fall again once he began training for the 1952 Olympics, running 409.9, 408, and then 407.8 to win a AAA title. As the Olympics came around, Bannister did a 3/4 mile time trial to prepare for his 1500 meter race, and reports claim his time was 2:52.9, which could very well support the potential of running a sub 4-minute mile. Not being prepared to run 2 heats of 1500 meters, Bannister placed 4th at the Olympics and went back to the cutting board. Meanwhile, an Australian runner by the name of John Landy had been the first man since the Swedes to truly flirt with under 4 minutes, running 4:02.1 in Melbourne. Bannister, understandably worried, knew he needed to take his training to the next level, and after breaking the British record in 1953 and doing it again in a time trial running 4:02, he knew at this point he had to consult someone and maybe bring along some company too. In late 1953, Franz Stanfield would be the coach Bannister felt comfortable with training him, especially when Stanfield proposed the concept of interval training to him, something that would eventually become a staple of distance running. The workout in question was incredibly straightforward: 10 repetitions of 1 lap around a 440-yard track with 2 minutes recovery. This workout was done multiple times a week to really cement that muscle memory of running sub 60-second laps, and he would be training with 2 other men for a change too: Chris Chataway and Chris Brasher. 66 seconds per lap was the starting point to test the waters, but Bannister would eventually work down to 61 seconds. He would run into his first notable plateau, however, as future sessions would result in no further progress towards performing these at under 4-minute pace. Taking a trip to the mountains in Scotland to de-stress and readjust, Bannister came back with a fresh mind and a fresh pair of legs, it seemed, as he was clicking off 58.9 seconds on average for his 10x440s now. With a proper taper and a couple time trials following shortly after, the stage was set at Oxford University, the place where it all started. May 16th, 1954, the date many were looking forward to. Brasher and Chataway ready to go to help with pacing, Bannister focused and prepped as he could ever be, and the weather miraculously clearing up despite obscene conditions earlier. If there was a day to pull it off before Landy got his hands on it, it had to be today. The first lap looked like any other race for Bannister: smooth, patient, and full of running. Coming through the first quarter in 57.5, the pace was swift, yet calculated as Bannister's training had been. The pace would even out a bit to come through the half mile at around the 1:58 mark, so the plan was going very well. After the half mile, Chris Chataway took the lead to take Bannister through the third lap, and they were just shy of the 3-minute mark they had planned, 3:04. This meant that Bannister would need a sub 60-second lap, a situation he had prepared day in and day out, doing the 10x440 repeats his coach had him do, and now was the time to see if its purpose would truly pull through when it mattered the most, and to make human history at the track that built him up to this very moment.
Up to the finishing line, time 3 minutes, 59.4 seconds, shattering the 4-minute mile, the Everest of athletic achievement.
I'm very glad to have done it in Oxford, because this was the track on which I ran my first mile race in my life about 7 years ago when I first came up to Oxford. And I'm very glad that it has come from England in the end.
Roger Bannister had become the first man in history to have run a mile in under 4 minutes. 3:59.4 was the time that was confirmed to between every referee and was a number that echoed throughout the world. Gunderhagen and Arne Andersson were certainly the pioneers of cornering the record down to its last few seconds in the 4-minute zone, but Roger Bannister was the one to truly close it out. We can't forget about his rival though, John Landy. That was just as close, if anything, closer to Bannister at one point towards the barrier. And if you were to predict a future record from him, you would be correct, as he too would run under 4 minutes for the mile and set a new world record just 2 weeks later, running 3:58.0. These would be the last 2 records from the lads that made 1954 a magical year, but it would be a complete dishonesty to not even include a more enthralling race between both Bannister and Landy at the Empire Games in August 1954. But it was more than just 2 men racing a mile. Some would call this race a miracle mile.
Both runners broke the 4-minute barrier. It truly was a miracle mile.
My great respect for him as an athlete, one of the greatest milers in the world, made me bring the very most out of myself. He's a very great runner, it was a privilege for me to run in that race. I have no excuse. I couldn't beat him under the circumstances, and he just out-kicked me in that final 70 or 80 yards, and that was all there was to it. I was very pleased that we both were able to break 4 minutes. It was a good, clean race, and it definitely went to the better man on the day.
Now that distance running's most prominent barrier had been broken, the gates were flooded with runners breaking the 4-minute barrier, as 3 men in the same race in 1955 ran 3:59, and 4 more men broke it in 1956. This trend continued smoothly into the next year, and British runner Derek Ibbotson would eye up the record with a 3:58.4 in Glasgow, and then exactly 2 weeks later, broke the record in London with a time of 3:57.2 on July 19, 1957. A little over a year later, one of the most consistent milers in history had finally been able to nab the world record amidst his 36 consecutive mile wins, as Herb Elliott broke the world record by 2.7 seconds with a time of 3:54.5 on August 6, 1958, along with another runner, Merv Lincoln, going under in 3:55.9. Elliott's record was the biggest jump in IAAF history, but he would abruptly retire 2 years later at the very young age of 22 to pursue a career in business. So the record was lowered significantly and then left alone for someone else to take over. Over the next few years, no miles would be performed under the 3:56 mark. In fact, almost all of 1958's notable mile times were composed from that race alone, and come another few years, no one was coming close. In their defense, it was insane for the record to fall that harshly in one single race, so perhaps a bit more time was necessary for athletes to properly develop their training plans to rival the raw talent Elliott exemplified. The next world record for the mile would be broken on a grass track. Fellow Kiwi Peter Snell broke the record in Wanganui with a time of 3:54.4 and then ran 3:54.1 in Auckland 2 years later.
The home stretch now, and 30,000 roaring spectators encouraging Snell on as he comes down this home straight. Snell, they roar. He comes up towards the finishing tape. He's through it. The time will let it view in a moment. Here it is. 3:54.1, a new world record. 3:54.1, and Tokyo again as the 3 place getters in the 1500 metres show together. It's Peter Snell, John Davies, Joseph Odlazul, and the crowd simmers with the excitement.
Akin to Elliott, Snell retired shortly after his record alongside obtaining 2 gold medals at the 1964 Olympics. French runner Michel Jezi would see his first world record after running 2 phenomenal miles in a single week span with 3:55.5 and 3:53.6 for a fantastic PR and a fresh world record to go along with it. Jazi's record, on the other hand, was in a scary situation already with 2 men just tenths of a second away, with Swedish runner Jürgen May clocking in at 3:53.8 and American James Ryan a tenth of a second under May. Both of them were now national record holders, but Ryan was able to bounce back in 1966 at the All-American Invitational in Berkeley with a time of 3:51.3, a 2.3 seconds improvement. If there's a pattern we've seen a few times by now, it's that when an athlete breaks a record, they end up breaking it again, and Ryan would lower the time 2/10 of a second more just a year later on June 23, 1967.
Accelerate coming around the turn. His power crowd on its feet as Jim Ryan pounds for home. 20 yards to go. And 10. We get 3:50.9 on the clock. What's our other time here? 3:51.2. It looks like he has not run the 3:50 mile, but we may have a new world record in the mile run. How about that, Jim?
Another grand jump had been made in the mile, and it didn't come as a shock that the world record halted for a couple years, and then a couple years more. Suddenly, the mile had gone its longest time without a record since Roger Bannister's 3:59. This is where the brief but fascinating story of Philbert Bayi comes into play. Philbert Bayi grew up in a small village in Tanzania, Karatu to be specific. The village sits at around 1,500 meters, which is considered pretty efficient for altitude training, although this was something that hadn't been thoroughly investigated or experimented with at the time. What possibly helped even more was that according to a newspaper report, Bayi was running 8 miles to and from school. By age 19, he had qualified for his first Olympic Games in both the 1,500 meter and 3,000 meter steeplechase, and built up a very respectable resume the very next year in the 1,500 meters. What put him in headlines was his legendary 1,500 meter win at the Commonwealth Games in Christchurch, where he defeated just about all of the best 1,500 meter runners out of nowhere and set the new world record in the event too. Bailly was able to capitalize off of this momentum and took Ryun's 1500 meter and mile world record now, beating it by 1/10 of a second on May 16th, 1975.
Dropping back into third. Here's the race. Bailly moving out. The strength. He's moving. It's going to be a great time. McCrory running a great time also. The field is spread. Walhooter coming from behind way back. No chance. Here comes Bailly. He breaks the tape and they're going crazy here in Kingston. McCrory also running a good race. But how can you look so good against a guy that's running 3:51?
3 months later, the man right behind Bailly during that very race, John Walker, would evidently be the one to break the 350 barrier for the first time in history, running 349.4 on August 12, 1975. Another 10-second barrier had been broken, and a fair bit faster than the 4:10 to under 4 barrier nonetheless. We've seen countries from all around the world bring it to this point, from the United States all the way to Tanzania, a fair bit of Sweden, and some Australians and Kiwis to sprinkle in too. But now I'd like to take a trip back down memory lane to a time where there was one, and only one country who had an utter stronghold on the event for over a century, and now they were back in full swing to take the record down farther than had ever gone before. That's right, the British are back. The two men in question that took the athletics world by storm are Sebastian Coe and Steve Ovett. Both are of very similar age and have even competed against each other as early as high school, but strangely enough, this would be one of the few times they would ever compete against each other in the coming years, and would really ever interact with each other. Let's just say that Coe and Ovett are very different characters. Coe grew up to be a prominent runner in his early teens. What was fairly unique to his training was that it was crafted by his father, Peter Coe, an engineer that had Sebastian focus more heavily on a regimen that consisted of high-intensity, low-volume training. Coe's focus in his starting days was mainly on the 800, as he won the European Indoor Championships in 1977 and secured a bronze medal at the Outdoor European Championships. He's calm, prefers to front-run races, and is generally considered to be a crowd pleaser and cordial to the press at events. If there was a wild card in the 70s and 80s for mid-distance running, it had to be Steve Ovett. Breaking the junior 800-meter record in 1974 and winning AAA titles 3 years in a row, the young superstar was a mid-distance tank that preyed on letting others take the lead and closing it out when it mattered the most. He even kept up with the world's best at the age of 20, at the Olympics placing 5th in the 800, but started to pick up steam in the 1500 as a couple years went by as well. His training consists of brute forcing triple-digit mile weeks and capitalizing off of his aerobic fitness with more neuromuscular workouts to have the legs ready by race day. He can also be quite the crowd pleaser at events, but when it comes to the press, he prefers to be left alone and very seldom engages in interviews. While Ovett had the earlier start in his international career, Coe's performances had exploded in 1979, taking the world record in 3 events in the span of 6 weeks, first in the 800, then the mile, and the 1500.
This field now, they're waking up in the pack behind, but it's too late, they're forgotten. Coe's got time to look around, the crowd are rising, and the time extremely fast, very near that world record, 3:49.4 it was, and he's underneath it. It's a new world record for Sebastian Coe, his second in 12 days, a phenomenal run, a fraction of a second under 3:49, another barrier broached by this remarkable young man.
Would you count yourself a miler now? Well, in the true sense of the word, no, because I'm not that really. This is the 4th mile in that many years. It's one a year for me. So really, to talk about experience at the mile, no, but obviously this time, means something.
Ovett's 800 time had virtually stagnated by this year, but he would finally find his stride and confidence in the 1500 and mile. And on July 1st, 1980, Ovett had broken Coe's record with a time of 3:48.8.
50 meters left. 45, 46, 47, 48. He's very, very close to the world record. Steve Cram in 2nd place. Graham Williamson 3rd. Well, Cram goes to Moscow. Williamson has waited.
The interesting thing about the two was that they almost never appeared in races together. It was either they ran the same event, but not at the same venue, or they ran at the same venue, but not the same event. In fact, one article notes that Coe had an Ovett avoidance clause associated with some sort of contract. The dynamic between the two had them competing strictly through numbers and almost never through placing, and it seemed they preferred to keep it that way. On August 19, 1981, the fastest mile race in history would be hosted in Zurich. There would be two British men in particular who stepped up to the line, but it wouldn't be Coe and Ovett for a change. Coe was present, but another British runner, Steve Cram, had been slowly climbing the ranks of the mile ladder, landing himself at number 7 overall, and John Walker, the previous record holder, was looking to take his title back too. Out in 56:13, the race was taken out pretty reasonably. The second split came through somewhat evenly too, as a nice 57:37 lap would have them at the half mile in 1:53:59. The pack was still relatively close all things considered, but lap 3 would immediately separate the men from the boys. Cram had led the race the whole time up until this point, but suddenly fell apart harshly back to the crowd, leaving Coe and Kenya runner Mike Bois to see what they had in the last lap, as with a 2:51 3/4 in, a 57-second lap was going to be necessary to break the record.
Well, they didn't stop the clock. They have now. He's outside it. Ovett's world record survived. And it looks as if the mile will survive as well. Coe going for home. Voigt in second place. Clarence third. Can Coe do it? And he's just done it. Voigt second. In third place was Cram. Fourth was Walker. 5 Vestigaga. 6 delays. And he came back, having missed the 1,500-meter record, to take the world mile record.
Sebastian Coe broke the record once again with a time of 3:48:53. There were now 7 men under 350, so the air was thick with milers hungry for a spot of stardom. But before Coe could even enjoy his time at the top once more, this would end up happening just the very next weekend.
Tracking Robinson, and as Ben fades, Robinson takes it up. 1:53.59 after 2 laps. Inside of the end of the third lap, and with about 450 metres left, Ovett takes it on as Robinson moves out of the way. Ramiti is in second place. Craig Masbach, 58 seconds. He's still kicking hard, a bit heavy-legged, but the strength is still there. 3:48.53 to beat. And the world record has gone. He's just inside it. The new figures, unofficially, 3:48.4. And Steve Ovett, within 7 days, gives Sebastian Coe his answer.
Steve Ovett took the record from Coe, finishing in 3:48.40. To make things even more eerie, Coe and Ovett's races came through the half-mile mark at exactly 1:53.59, which means they finished quite similarly too. These two were in sync by all statistical grounds possible, but still couldn't be farther apart at the same time. Ovett finished with relief and clarity with a second and hopefully comfortable record that Coe couldn't grasp at, but he wouldn't be given more than 2 days until Coe traveled to Brussels to end the mile rivalry once and for all with this time.
Looking very, very happy in front. Coe in second place. The time at 2 laps. That is astonishing. Nearly 3 seconds inside of Ed's time. Tremendous piece of pacemaking by Baz, who's had enough. Coe left in front, and he's got to go. Voigt in second place. And they've slowed down. 2:51, just outside the record. And Coe really has got to run a tremendous last lap. Voigt is closing slightly. Where is the Coe kick? Coe coming away again. 60,000 people on there. Coe's roaring Coe home. He's got a tremendous revival there. And he comes home with a new world record. 3 minutes, 47.3. Voigt in second place. But that is what Coe wanted to do. And this, really, you can call a miracle run.
3:47.33. An entire second was dropped even after all the back and forth from them dropping it just by mere tenths. Coe wanted the last lap, and he got exactly what he wanted. Ovett was not able to pursue his career in track and field in the coming years due to health issues and consistent injuries, but if it weren't for him and the intense rivalry he shared between Coe, the mile really would have not dropped as fast as it did in that short amount of time. Coe would retire with a couple gold medals, a European Championship title, and tons of other high placements that solidified him as the best mid-distance runner to ever live at this point. To end the British saga, Steve Cram came out of nowhere after being injured in 1984 and came back to the Olympic Games for a second place to Coe. But as for who would truly finish with the fastest mile, Cram would be the Brit to hold the flag nice and high for the rest to see.
Is Gonzalez of Spain, second is Scott of America, eighth is Flynn, and ninth is Walker. 153.82 at 880 yards. Time, and the time at the bell, 253.14. And Coe's time, and he broke the record. Coe kick off a fast pace like this, and Cram is going away. He's now 5 meters clear, and Coe is beaten. And Coe relaxes, he knows that Cram is away and gone. And the world champion, the European champion, the Commonwealth champion, the world record holder at 1,500 meters, majestically comes striding away. This time, is it to crack the world record? Yes, it is. 3:46.3. Gonzalez second, Coe third, Scott fourth. Bile 5, Water 6, Flynn 7. To go away from a field of this class so early and run right away from it. And suddenly, for the old world record holder, well, he knew his days were numbered.
3:46.32 was the new mark Steve Cram left for the rest of the world to conquer, but come the beginning of the 90s, and only one other athlete would run 3:46, Saïd Aouida of Morocco in 1987, with the rest of the times being in the 3:49s. World record culture for distance races had been seeing better days, as they had slowly been diminishing in general by the 90s, as the 1500 stagnated in 1985, only a single record in the 3,000 meter steeplechase in the 80s, and the 5,000 meters halted in 1987. The 90s were looking to be a bleak moment in the track and field record books, where the shift went from races going guns blazing from the start to a more tactical approach where races were looking for first places and nothing more. These records were also maybe just hitting their breaking point too, and with almost no new milers on the rise, and the growing popularity of the metric mile, who was going to take the next step? Noureddin Morceli is a mid-distance runner hailing from Algeria. At age 7, he took astute appreciation for his older brother, Abderrahmani Morceli, when he saw him place 4th at the 1500 meter World Cup behind Steve Ovett. Noureddin took heavy inspiration and showcased massive potential in his junior years, running 3:40.41 for 1500 meters in 1988 at just the age of 18 and placing 2nd at the World Junior Championships in the same event. By 1989, he had enrolled at the Riverside Community College and dropped his time a few more seconds in the 1500 meters and ran the mile once to nab a sub 4. Lastly, in 1992, he broke the 1500 meter world record after a close attempt, but the mile was going to be a bit harder to shake for him. 1993 was the year where Morceli recognized his potential to become the undisputed mid-distance king, winning every 1500 meter race he entered yet again with a world championship title in Stuttgart. Coming hot off his second world championship title, Morceli decided he wanted a chance at beating Steve Cram's insane 3:46.32. First attempt, Berlin. He came just half a second short at 3:46.78, but had another race scheduled the week after in Brussels. 3:47.30, a second shy, and a tad slower. Morceli wasn't favoring the race conditions for these attempts, but a third time just might be the charm he needs on his side to manage both the metric and imperial mile records simultaneously.
Noureddin Morceli, vedete impegnato, sciolto, speriamo che il vento non lo danneggi, ormai 100 metri alla conclusione, 3:29.57, proiezione Monetti.
Al 1.500 questo, dunque può fare il primato?
Attenzione, ci siamo, è primato del mondo, 3:46.32 da battere, è primato del mondo!
Grande!
3:44.38 e qui non c'è vento che tenga, grande primato del mondo, ha cancellato Steve Cram di quasi 2 secondi. 3:46.32, il primato di Oslo, luglio 1985.
3:44.39, a near 2-second drop. It almost didn't seem believable to drop the record this much at this point in time, where training methods were slowly becoming more and more optimized. But Morceli wanted to make sure that if he wanted to set the record in the mile, he wanted to do it in a way where no single athlete could touch him. At least, that's what he had hoped would be the case. Moroccan running at the elite level was a rarity, with very few top runners present in the sport's history. Despite this, the country still had Saïd Aouida, who held the world record in the 1500 for 7 years and had the fastest mile time in Morocco by a massive 8 seconds. In the mid-90s, a complete anomaly just like Aouida entered the scene, with an improvement rate no one had ever seen before, and his training was rumored to be so gruesomely difficult that it would be almost impossible for anyone to train with him for a few days. This man went by the name of Hicham El Guerrouj. Hicham El Guerrouj, a man that an athlete as prestigious as Saïd Aouida would predict to have the most potential at becoming the best 1500-meter runner ever seen. Leaving his parents at the age of 16 to join the National Institute of Athletics in Rabat, El Guerrouj had placed third at his first international track race in Korea, running 13:46 in the 5,000 meters. Spending another year within the cross-country realm, El Guerrouj eventually made the permanent shift to track and field with more attention to the 1500, where he had already been capable of running 3:33 and 3:53 for the mile at the age of 20. In 1996, he began racing even more and had qualified for his first Olympics. With a world-leading time for that year, El Guerrouj won both of his heats, but during the finals, he caught himself in what would be one of the most devastating fails in Olympic history.
As it's El Guerrouj that moves up onto the shoulder. Oh, he fell down. El Guerrouj fell down, and Morceli has the lead. El Guerrouj was vying for the lead with Morceli when he went down. And there's the man who fell, El Guerrouj, who was just making a bid for the lead to run with Morceli when he was tripped up and fell to the track.
With an appetite for redemption, El Guerrouj was willing to take his training to the next level. Mexican women's team coach Marco Veladiaz had observed and reported El Guerrouj's training. Most of the workouts he reported make logical sense by most training standards, but some are so outlandish that they can almost be seen as likely misreported. Hill workouts, ladder workouts, fartleks all seem just fine and dandy on paper. But Veladiaz also reports that for the aerobic endurance section, he was actively running at 250 to 3 flat or 310 per kilometer for 30 to 45 minutes with 30 more minutes of recovery. Converted to per mile pace, this would mean his aerobic work was 434 to 506 mile pace. Outside of this, his track workouts check out for a world-class miler, doing 2K repeats in 5:10, 1K repeats in 2:30, and of course, the classic 10x400 meters workout. These were done at 53 to 54 seconds, and if that didn't sound crazy enough, he was only allowed 30 seconds of rest in between. These workouts were to get him conditioned to the brim for 1500 meter race after another, but our main focus is on the mile, and despite his seldom interest in the event, it was enough to still lead his curiosity towards a world record attempt on July 4th, 1997.
The world record in the mile, 3 minutes, 44.39 seconds, held by Noureddin Morceli of Algeria, set in 1993. The American record, 3:47.69, owned by Steve Scott. And we have a terrific...
The race started out blazing hot. A quick separation formed almost immediately, which is quite uncommon in events this short, but when you realize what their first lap was, it starts to make a bit more sense. 53.74 for the first quarter was insanely fast. A quick adjustment was necessary, and an adjustment there was, as a few men clicked off their second lap in 57.71. A harsh adjustment, sure, but the commentators noted a time of 2:48 for the pacemaker to come through, and El Guerrouj, poised and disciplined, came through at exactly that time. With just 400 to go, it was time to see if he could bring the mile record to Morocco for the first time ever.
It is El Guerrouj powering away with less than 50, maybe 70 meters to go.
Those marks on the left were the metric equivalent, 1,500 meters. You saw he's about 2 seconds off of that world record. To the line he comes. He will miss it by the tiniest of margins unofficially, 3:44.9.
Unbelievable. The second fastest mile ever run in history easily. And he is, as you say, about 7/10 of a second off the best ever, 6/10 of a second off the world record.
Despite a fantastic adjustment after a shocking first lap to come through the 1200 perfectly in 2:48, El Guerrouj missed the record by half a second. Next year he attempted the same thing, and the time would be 3:44.60, now just 2/10 away. His new world record in the 1500 suspected he could run a 3:42 mile now, but conversions are conversions at the end of the day. With only a couple attempts at the mile a year, the pace would need to be perfect from the start, and on July 7th, 1999, things couldn't have looked more perfect because he returned to the very track he set his 1,500-meter world record on.
Of this mile race, there is also a $50,000 prize for anyone who establishes a world record. You just saw Kevin Sullivan.
The pace looked much more patient this time. No rushing through the first 200 meant the following 200 would lead the front pack through the quarter in a nice 55.07. The rest of the field dropped very shortly after, but one runner decided to test the waters a bit to see how long he could keep up with the #1 mid-distance runner in the world. 20-year-old Kenyan Noah Nian ambitiously came through the half mile with Guerrouj in 1:51.58, nearly identical to his 1997 attempt. The fearless duo had not shaken each other, but Guerrouj maintained his lead and composure to still come through the third lap in that magical 2:48. 2:47.91 though might have just been enough leeway to give him the breathing room needed to set the new world record, but he could not just seem to shake Nian off, and if anything, the up-and-coming Kenyan only started to inch closer. The crowd was roaring. The youth phenomenon was ready to pull off an upset of a lifetime, and as the two went stride for stride near the end, they might have known they had the record, but they were not sure who was going to get it.
Great Moroccan runner and sticks close to him coming off the turn with 100 meters to go. He's still there.
Nayan trying to move in on Hikam Guerrouj. He's closing. Watch the time. The world record 3:44.39. They race to the finish line. Hikam Guerrouj is going to hang on. He's got a world record. 3:43.12. As a matter of fact, both Guerrouj and Nayan went under the former world record time.
Isham Guerrouj had fended off Noah Nian at the very last second to take the title back to Morocco with a staggering time of 3:43.13, and Noah Nian also breaking it by over a second with 3:43.40. It is quite possible to assume that this is the best mid-distance race ever performed in track and field history, and it comes as no surprise that Isham Guerrouj continued his resume to eventually retire as the king of middle distance running. The record has not even been remotely threatened since its arrival on that day in 1999. In fact, the fastest mile that was ran in the 2000s was by Alan Webb in 2007 to break Steve Scott's American record. The 90s was just a magical decade in general for the mile, but it was also at the very end of its hyperactive lifespan, as the shift to the 1500 had solidified its welcome, and the mile more so lives on as a Western tradition, occasionally ran by professionals in certain Diamond League events. The mile is a truly magical distance that might have run its course at this point. It's not to say someone can't break the record, but we're more likely to see the 1500-meter one fall just by pure statistical likelihood. The British laid out the foundation for the mile being raced, with legends like Walter George, Sir Roger Bannister, and the fascinating rivalry between Sebastian Coe and Steve Ovett, only for it to be ended out of nowhere by Steve Cram. What could be just as appreciated, however, is the diversity of athletes that follow too, with places like Sweden, New Zealand, Tanzania, Algeria, and Morocco, all working towards one focused goal, even when the mile was on its decline in popularity. Now, all of you are wondering, is a sub 340 mile possible? If record-breaking culture surfaces again, it's something that's at least worth entertaining. But until someone runs 344, 345, or hell, even 346, Guerrouj may remain as the king of the mile for years or decades to come. No record is truly safe, so keep your eyes peeled for who may possibly be the new king of the mile throne. But until then, this has been the world record progression of the mile, and thanks for watching. Thank you to all my patrons for supporting the channel, and if you want to support the channel for more documentaries like this, come be a patron, and hey, drop a sub if you're new here too. I'll see you on whatever video I upload next, and take care.